I found out on a Thursday. I was still wearing the hospital bracelet. The ink on my discharge papers was barely dry. The cramping had not fully stopped. I had been home for exactly 4 hours. 4 hours since they discharged me from Richmond Memorial with a pamphlet about grief resources and a prescription for pain medication I had not yet filled. When I sat down at the kitchen table, reached for my laptop to distract myself from everything my body was still processing, and saw the email notification that changed everything I thought I understood about my marriage. It was forwarded to me by accident. By Marcus's personal assistant, a young woman named Julia, who had clearly meant to send it to a different address and mistyped it in the particular way that people mistype things when they are hurrying, when they are anxious, when they are managing something they are not entirely comfortable managing. The email contained a contract. A 6-month residential management contract, dated 2 days earlier, while I was still in the hospital, for a woman named Celeste Morrow, who was being formally hired as the live-in household coordinator for a home in Charlottesville, Virginia. The responsibilities listed in the contract included management of daily household operations, personal scheduling, event coordination, and, this was the specific line I read 3 times before it fully landed, companionship and personal support for household principals. The contract was signed by my husband, Marcus Reed. Our home is not a large estate. We are not a family that has ever employed a live-in household coordinator. We do not have a household large enough, or complicated enough, to require one. I manage our home myself. I have managed it for 6 years of marriage, while also working full-time as a corporate attorney. I stared at that contract for a long time, still in my coat, still wearing the hospital bracelet around my wrist, the discharge papers folded in my bag exactly where I'd put them 4 hours earlier when Marcus drove me home from the hospital in a silence I had attributed, charitably, to shared grief. Then I picked up my phone. And I began, right then, from the kitchen table of the house where I had miscarried our child 48 hours earlier, to dismantle everything Marcus thought he had quietly put in place while I was too devastated to be paying attention. My name is Nina Reed. I am 34 years old. I am a corporate litigation attorney at a firm in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I have spent the past 8 years building a career specifically on the ability to recognize a fraudulent arrangement when I see one. Marcus Reed is 37. He runs his family's commercial property development business, a mid-sized firm that his grandfather founded, and that Marcus has expanded significantly in the decade since taking it over. He is charming in the way that men who grew up in money are often charming, effortlessly without seeming to try, in a way that initially read to me as genuine warmth and only later, with appropriate distance, resolved into something more like practice performance. We married 6 years ago. I was 28, he was 31, and I believed, with the confidence of a woman who had built an entire career on the ability to read people and situations accurately, that I knew exactly who I had chosen. I was wrong. But I did not understand precisely how wrong until a forwarded email landed in my inbox while I was still wearing a hospital bracelet. Let me tell you about the pregnancy because it matters for understanding the full context of what Marcus did. We had been trying for almost 2 years. 2 years of ovulation tracking and temperature charts and the specific, exhausting hope that lives inside every month that ends without a positive result. I had undergone preliminary fertility testing 6 months earlier, which had identified some minor irregularities that the doctor described, carefully and with considerable reassurance, as addressable but worth monitoring. When I finally got the positive test, on a Tuesday morning in February, I sat on the bathroom floor for almost 20 minutes, crying in a way I have rarely allowed myself to cry about anything, before composing myself enough to call Marcus at his office. He came home immediately. He brought flowers. He was, throughout the first 8 weeks of the pregnancy, exactly the attentive, present, emotionally engaged husband I had always believed, during the harder stretches of our fertility journey, that he would be if we finally got what we had been working toward. The miscarriage happened at 10 weeks. Without warning, without any preceding complication, in the way miscarriages happen, suddenly and completely, the body simply withdrawing what it had briefly promised. I called Marcus from the hospital, and he arrived within 20 minutes. He held my hand throughout the D&C procedure. He drove me home. He said all the right things. And at some point during the 36 hours I spent in that hospital, he also signed a 6-month contract with a woman named Celeste Moreau to live in our house. I only know this because of a mistyped email address. I opened the contract again, 3 hours after I first found it, having spent the intervening time on the phone with my paralegal, asking her to pull everything she could find about Celeste Moreau. What my paralegal found was not what you might expect if the arrangement were genuinely a household management hire. Celeste Moreau was 27 years old. She had a bachelor's degree in hospitality management from a state school in Georgia, which was legitimate. She had 2 years of experience working at a boutique hotel in Atlanta, which was also legitimate, and which was the last verifiable employment on her professional history. What came after those 2 years was less straightforward. Her LinkedIn profile was spare, carefully worded. But her Instagram account, public, with over 3,000 followers, told a rather different story. A series of photographs over the past 8 months showed her at various locations: a ski resort in Colorado, a private beach club in the Bahamas, a rooftop restaurant in New York that I recognized immediately as one Marcus had mentioned visiting for a business dinner last September. In 3 of those photographs, taken at 3 different locations, a man's arm was visible at the edge of the frame. Same watch in all 3. A watch I recognized. I have a good memory for details. It is what makes me an effective litigator. I had given Marcus that watch for his 35th birthday. I sat in my kitchen with my laptop and my phone and a yellow legal pad, still wearing the hospital bracelet, and I began writing down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I intended to find out before I said a single word to my husband about any of it. I am a litigator. I do not make accusations without evidence. I build cases. I had approximately 3 days before Celeste Moreau's contracted start date. I want to describe the next 72 hours as precisely as I can, because they were, I think, the most focused and consequential work I have ever done in my professional life, conducted from a kitchen table while my body recovered from a pregnancy loss and my marriage dissolved in the background of what I had always believed was an ordinary spring Thursday. I called my best friend and colleague, Diane Ashworth, at 6 in the evening. Diane is a family law specialist at a firm across town, which meant she was simultaneously my best personal confidant and the exactly correct professional resource for what I now understood I was about to need. Diane, I said, when she picked up, I need you to listen to me very carefully for the next 10 minutes, and then I need you to tell me the best course of action, not as my friend, but as a family law attorney. Go ahead, she said, and I heard her tone shift immediately into the careful, precise register of a colleague rather than a friend. That shift, more than anything else that happened in those first few hours, steadied me. I told her everything. The forwarded email, the contract, the photographs on Instagram, the watch. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Send me the contract, she said. Right now, while we're on the phone. I sent it. She read it in silence for almost 2 minutes. Nina, she said, this contract describes responsibilities that have no legitimate place in a household management document for a private residence the size of yours. Companionship and personal support for household principals is not a standard clause in any residential staffing arrangement I have ever encountered in 15 years of family law practice. I know, I said. This reads like someone who needed a legal framework for an arrangement they didn't want to characterize as what it actually is, Diane said. And the timing. She stopped herself, the professional precision briefly giving way to something more human. Nina. He signed this while you were in the hospital. He signed it 2 days before I was discharged, I said. Another pause. Okay, she said, and her voice had shifted back into full professional mode, the mode I had come to rely on across a decade of friendship and occasional professional overlap. Here's what you do not do. You do not confront Marcus tonight. You do not let him know you've seen this contract. You do not say anything that gives him the opportunity to alter his behavior, cover his tracks, or move any shared financial assets before you've had the opportunity to protect yourself properly. I know how this works, I said. I know you do, she said. I'm saying it anyway, because you've been through something devastating today, and I need you to stay in attorney mode rather than wife mode for the next 72 hours. I've been in attorney mode since 6 o'clock, I said. Good, she said. Then here's what we're doing tomorrow. The next 72 hours were, externally, completely ordinary. Marcus came home from his office that evening and found me exactly where he expected to find me, lying on the couch with a heating pad the hospital had recommended, watching something unmemorable on television. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was tired. He ordered food because I had not cooked and he had not expected me to. We ate together at the kitchen table, 6 feet from the laptop where I had read the contract 3 hours earlier, and I said nothing about any of it. I am very good at compartmentalization. It is what allows me to be an effective advocate for clients who are going through things I personally find repugnant. I can hold my actual feelings at a professional remove, while I do what needs to be done. I have always considered this ability a professional asset. That evening, it became something else entirely. While Marcus watched television in the living room and believed himself to be living inside an ordinary, if grief-shadowed, Thursday night, I was in my home office, on the phone with our financial institution, requesting a complete review of all shared account activity for the past 12 months. I was also, systematically, transferring the balance of the joint savings account, 11 years of accumulated shared savings, into a personal account I had opened that afternoon at a different bank entirely. Diane had told me, during our earlier call, that Virginia law permits a spouse to access and move joint funds prior to initiating divorce proceedings, provided it does not constitute wasteful dissipation of marital assets. Moving money to protect it from a spouse who has demonstrated a pattern of financial deception is not dissipation. It is protection. By 10 o'clock that evening, the joint savings account contained approximately $40 and some change. Marcus's next billing statement would reflect this. I intended to be long past the point of caring about his billing statements by the time that happened. On the second day after the hospital, I hired a private investigator. His name was Robert Chen, a former detective with 22 years of experience, and he came recommended by Diane with a specific comment. He is the best in this region, and he does not waste time.
He did not waste time.
Within 36 hours of being retained, Robert had confirmed, through a combination of public record searches, financial record requests, and a level of surveillance methodology, I did not ask him to detail the following. Marcus and Celeste Moreau had been in a relationship for approximately 8 months. The ski trip, the Bahamas Beach Club, the New York dinner, all confirmed as joint trips, booked through Marcus's corporate travel account, which had recorded them as business expenses. The contract I had discovered was not, as it might appear, the beginning of the arrangement. It was the formalization of an arrangement that had already been ongoing for months, an attempt to construct a papered justification for her presence in our home, my home. Once the living situation itself became the next stage of whatever Marcus had been planning. What he had been planning, according to everything Robert and Diane's combined investigation eventually uncovered, was a transition. A transition that he had apparently decided to execute while I was in the hospital, grieving because, and this is the part that still, even now, strikes me as the most calculated detail of the entire ordeal. It was the moment when he believed I would be least capable of noticing and least capable of fighting back. I confronted him on day 3. Not because I had run out of things to investigate or document. Because Celeste Moreau's contracted start date was the following morning, and I needed him to understand, clearly and completely, that she would not be walking through that door. Marcus came home from work at 6:30 to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of me, a glass of water I had not touched, and an expression that he apparently read, correctly, as something beyond ordinary. "Hey," he said, setting down his bag, reading the room in the specific, wary way that people read rooms when something is fundamentally wrong but they haven't yet identified the specific source of the wrongness. "How are you feeling?" "Sit down, Marcus," I said. He sat. I slid the contract across the table toward him.
He looked at it.
I watched the color leave his face in the specific, immediate way it leaves faces when a person realizes that something they believed was hidden has been seen. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Julia mistyped the forwarding address," I said. "She sent it to my email by accident. She intended to send it to your personal address. She mistyped it." I paused. "It happens." He said nothing. He was looking at the contract rather than at me, which told me everything about where his thoughts had immediately gone. Not toward any explanation or justification, but toward damage control, toward the practical question of exactly how much I knew and what that meant for whatever plan he had been constructing. "Look at me," I said. He looked up. "Celeste Moreau," I said, "is not setting foot in this house tomorrow or any other day. I want to be completely clear about that before we have any other conversation." "Nina, I'm not finished," I said, my voice sharpening with a precision that I recognized, even as I felt it, as the voice I use in depositions when a witness is about to attempt something that will not work. "I know she's not a household coordinator. I know you've been in a relationship with her for 8 months. I know about Colorado, the Bahamas, and New York, and I know all 3 trips were charged to your business account as expenses, which means there is a tax fraud question here in addition to everything else. I know the contract was signed 2 days ago, while I was in the hospital. I know you drove me home from the hospital, helped me to the couch, kissed my forehead, and then went back to your phone to finalize the arrangements for the woman you've been seeing for 8 months to move into our house the week after my miscarriage." I let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. "I need you," I continued, "to understand something fundamental. You made a catastrophic error in judgment, not just morally, not just maritally, but strategically. You chose the one window of time when you believed I would be too devastated to notice, too emotionally destroyed to pay attention. But I am an attorney, Marcus. I have spent 8 years learning to pay attention to exactly the things people hope will go unnoticed when they believe someone else is distracted." I picked up the folder and opened it, spreading documents across the table between us. The joint account, the financial records, the hotel bookings, the photographs, Robert Chen's preliminary report, which I'm sure your own attorney will find instructive when we proceed with discovery. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I have been thorough," I said. "I have been thorough because I am always thorough, and because you gave me 3 days to be thorough while you believed I was simply lying on the couch with a heating pad, too broken to function. I want to make sure you understand that clearly before we continue. You've been planning this since," he stopped. "Since the evening I came home from the hospital and found your assistant's forwarded email in my inbox, yes." I closed the folder. 3 days, Marcus. That's all it took. 3 days from a hospital bed to a complete preliminary case file. Imagine what 6 months of discovery is going to produce. He was quiet for a long moment. The silence in that kitchen was unlike any silence I had ever experienced in 6 years of marriage in that room. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way," he said finally. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who has assessed the situation and understood that he is significantly behind. "How exactly did you mean for me to find out?" I said, "Because your plan, as far as I can reconstruct it, involved a live-in girlfriend arriving at our house the day after I came home from the hospital, which suggests the timeline in your head did not actually include a thoughtful conversation about ending our marriage before introducing the next chapter of yours." "It's more complicated than that," he said. "Simplify it for me," I said.
He looked at me.
I stared back. "I've been unhappy," he said finally, and the words landed with a peculiar, almost offensive lightness, given the scale of everything surrounding them. "I've been unhappy for a long time, and I didn't know how to tell you, and then Celeste."
"Stop," I said.
"I'm going to stop you there, because I need you to hear me very carefully. Whatever unhappiness you have been carrying, whatever dissatisfaction with our marriage prompted 8 months of a secret relationship, you maintained that secret for 8 months. 8 months during which I underwent fertility testing. 8 months during which I got pregnant for the first time after 2 years of trying. 8 months during which I miscarried and spent 2 days in a hospital, and during which you sat beside me holding my hand while simultaneously finalizing the housing arrangements for the woman you've been sleeping with." I paused. "You don't get to tell me about your unhappiness right now," I said. "You don't get credit for having complicated feelings. What you get is the outcome of the choices you made. And the choice you made was to sign that contract 2 days before I was discharged from the hospital, which means I'm going to make sure every single piece of this goes through the proper legal channels, thoroughly and completely, with exactly the same attention to detail I would apply to any other case in which someone has attempted to take advantage of a vulnerable moment to execute a fraudulent arrangement." He stared at me. I think he had expected something different. Tears, perhaps. Or screaming. The particular devastation of a woman who had just lost a pregnancy, discovering simultaneously that her marriage was over. He had likely imagined, if he had imagined my reaction at all, that it would look like breaking, not like litigation strategy delivered across a kitchen table at 7 in the evening. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should speak to your attorney." "I've been speaking to my attorney since 6 o'clock the evening I found the contract," I said. "Diane says hello, by the way. She wants you to know she's taking this case personally, which I thought you'd appreciate given that she has known me for 12 years. The specific look on his face when I said Diane's name told me everything I needed to know about whether he had ever imagined that particular development. He had not. "I want you to sleep somewhere else tonight," I said. "And tomorrow. I am not leaving this house, and Celeste Moreau is not entering it. I would strongly suggest you communicate that to her before she shows up at the door in the morning with her luggage, because I will not be managing that situation diplomatically." He left that night. He took a bag. He did not argue about it, which told me that whatever he had expected from this conversation, what he had received had clarified the landscape in terms he understood. I want to tell you what the following months actually looked like, because I think the reality of rebuilding after this kind of betrayal matters as much as the dramatic peak of the confrontation. The divorce proceeded with the kind of thoroughness I had promised from that kitchen table. Diane was relentless. The financial irregularities Robert Chen's investigation had uncovered, the business expense fraud, the shared account manipulation that Marcus had apparently begun months earlier, strengthened my position significantly. The signed contract itself, with its carefully worded language about personal support, provided exactly the documentary evidence Diane had identified in our first conversation as damning beyond what any verbal explanation could undo. Marcus's attorney attempted, predictably, to reframe the contract as a legitimate household management arrangement. Diane destroyed that argument with approximately 45 minutes of deposition testimony from Robert Chen and 2 additional witnesses who had observed Marcus and Celeste at a level of familiarity inconsistent with any professional relationship. I received the house in the settlement. This was important to me not primarily for financial reasons, though the house represented a substantial asset. But because I had chosen it, I had decorated it, I had spent 6 years of marriage building a home inside it, and I was not going to allow Marcus's decision to formalize his affair inside its walls while I was still in the hospital to result in me being displaced from my own life. Celeste Moreau, as far as I know, never moved into that house. Whatever Marcus had imagined when he signed that contract, the reality of what followed it apparently shifted his circumstances considerably, and the carefully planned domestic transition he had seemingly anticipated executing in the wake of a grief-softened wife's distraction did not materialize the way he had planned. I do not know, and have made no effort to discover, what eventually happened between Marcus and Celeste. I think about them occasionally, not with longing, not with ongoing anger, but with the specific, distant curiosity that sometimes attaches to situations that once felt enormously significant and have since receded into something closer to history. What I think about more often is the hospital bracelet, the detail that I still find, 3 years later, the most difficult to fully absorb about everything that happened. I gave it to Diane after the divorce was finalized, not as any kind of symbolic gesture, just because I found it in a drawer one afternoon, still stored in the same coat pocket where I had dropped it the day I came home from the hospital, and I didn't know what else to do with it. She put it in the file. I don't know why, and I didn't ask. Some evidence, I think, doesn't need a purpose beyond existing, beyond being the physical proof that a thing actually happened, that it was real, that the sequence of events that followed it actually occurred in the order they did. I want to tell you something about grief, because I think this story, told in the terms it mostly gets told in, the discovery, the confrontation, the legal proceedings, can accidentally flatten the other thing that was also happening throughout all of it. I lost a pregnancy. That is not a footnote to the betrayal. It is its own separate, significant thing, and it existed simultaneously with everything else I have described, threaded through every phone call, every document review, every deposition preparation session, every morning I woke up in a house where I had expected, 2 weeks earlier, to be building towards something entirely different. I want to be honest about the fact that I cried far more in those months than I probably showed to anyone, including Diane. I am a private person. I do not perform my grief publicly, and the particular grief of pregnancy loss, layered under the particular grief of a marriage collapsing simultaneously, is a complicated, nonlinear thing that does not resolve neatly on any timeline. I went to therapy. I went consistently for almost 18 months, with a therapist named Dr. Ellen Marsh who was, among other things, wise enough to understand that the two griefs needed to be addressed separately rather than collapsed into each other, that losing a pregnancy and losing a marriage are each their own devastation with their own timeline of processing, and that the specific, complicated anger of discovering a betrayal at the exact moment of greatest vulnerability sometimes requires real, sustained work to fully metabolize into something that does not permanently alter how you move through the world. I have not remarried. I tried dating carefully about a year after the divorce was finalized and found that I was not yet ready, not because I was still in love with Marcus, but because I had not yet fully rebuilt, from the inside, my own certainty about my ability to read situations and people accurately. I had spent 8 years believing I was exceptionally good at that, and then spent one specific, terrible week discovering that the most significant relationship of my adult life had contained an 8-month secret I had completely missed. I take more time now. I pay more attention. Not to the extent that I have become incapable of trust, but to the extent that I no longer mistake fluency in the performance of a thing for the genuine presence of the thing itself. 3 years later, I am still at the firm. I have been promoted to partner, a development that occurred 14 months after the divorce was finalized, during a period when I threw myself into work with an intensity that my colleagues described as formidable and that I privately understood as necessary, as the particular kind of productivity that sometimes follows devastation. When building something real and verifiable feels like the only reliable antidote to the specific, destabilizing experience of discovering that something you believed was real actually wasn't. The house is still mine. I have repainted 2 rooms and replaced the kitchen table, the one at which I read the contract, at which I confronted Marcus, at which I spent 2 weeks conducting the most consequential work of my professional life from inside my own marriage. The new table is different in color and shape, a deliberate choice rather than an unconscious one. I try to get pregnant again. This is the most personal detail of everything I have shared, and I share it because I think it belongs in any honest account of the story, not as a redemptive note, not as a conclusion that wraps anything neatly, but simply because it is true. I am 36 now. I am trying again, through a different kind of path than the one I had imagined 3 years ago, with a clearer understanding of what the process might require and a more honest accounting of what I actually want, separate from what my marriage had once seemed to promise. I do not know how that will go. I know that I am approaching it with the same thorough, methodical attention I have brought to everything else in the 3 years since a forwarded email landed in my inbox on a Thursday afternoon while I was still wearing a hospital bracelet. I learned, that week, that the moment of someone else's greatest calculation can become the moment of your own greatest clarity. If you refuse to be as distracted as they assumed you would be, if you pay attention anyway, if you bring every skill you actually possess to bear on a situation that was designed to catch you at your most vulnerable. Marcus thought he had timed things perfectly. He had looked at a woman in a hospital bed and seen someone too broken to pay attention. He was looking at a litigator. He should have known better. I think at some level he did know better, and he bet against that knowledge anyway, betting that grief and devastation and physical recovery would be enough to slow me down, to give him the 3-day window he needed to get everything in place before I understood what was happening. He lost that bet comprehensively. I intend to keep losing it in his favor for the rest of my life, by which I mean, I intend to keep being exactly the kind of person who pays attention at precisely the moment other people assume she isn't, for every remaining year that I have. That is the whole of what happened, and the whole of what I decided to do about it. I want to describe the full scope of what Robert's investigation uncovered, because the summary I gave earlier understates the depth of premeditation involved. Robert delivered his preliminary findings 48 hours after I retained him, a timeline he told me, with understated professional pride, was unusually fast, but was achievable because the subject had not been particularly careful. People who believe their partners are too distracted to notice what they're doing tend to become careless, Robert said, setting a manila folder on my kitchen table on the morning of day 3. Your husband was careless. He was remarkably careless. The Colorado ski trip in January, marked in Marcus's business calendar as a client relations conference, had been booked through his corporate travel account using a name pairing that appeared professional at a glance, but that, on closer examination, contained Celeste's middle name rather than a client's company name. A small misfiling that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Robert found 7 additional trips over the 8-month period, 4 of which had been similarly mischaracterized on business expense records. The total value of those fraudulently claimed expenses exceeded $22,000, a number that would later become one of the more straightforward components of the financial fraud case that ran parallel to the divorce proceedings. "There's something else," Robert said, sliding a second document across the table. His personal email, which he had forwarded, at some point, to an account he apparently forgot was accessible through a device logged into your home network, contains a thread from approximately 3 weeks ago that I think you should read. I looked at the document. It was a printed email exchange between Marcus and a woman whose name I recognized as his personal attorney, not the same attorney who would later represent him in our divorce, but someone he had apparently been consulting about what he described, in his own words, as transitioning out of my current domestic situation with minimal financial disruption. The emails were dated 3 weeks before my miscarriage, before the positive pregnancy test was even 2 months old. I want you to understand what that means. While I was still in the early stages of a pregnancy we had spent 2 years waiting for, Marcus had already begun consulting his attorney about how to exit our marriage with, in his own carefully chosen words, minimal financial disruption. He had been researching asset protection strategies and divorce timeline management 3 weeks before the miscarriage placed me in a hospital bed and apparently provided him with what he decided was the ideal window to accelerate his plans. He was already planning to leave, I said, stating the obvious for the record, as attorneys sometimes do. For at least 3 weeks before your hospitalization, Robert said. Possibly longer. The email thread suggests a relationship with his attorney on this topic that predates the thread's opening date. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the full shape of it settle into a clarity that, paradoxically, was easier to hold than the confusion of not fully understanding it. He had not made a desperate, reactive decision during the crisis of my miscarriage. He had been planning a deliberate transition for weeks, possibly months, and my hospitalization had simply provided him with what he apparently calculated as an operationally convenient window, a period when I was physically and emotionally compromised enough that he could formalize the housing arrangements for Celeste without the risk of my noticing or objecting before they were fait accompli. The miscarriage, in other words, had not caused the plan. It had simply accelerated a plan already in progress. "Thank you," I told Robert, closing the folder. "This is exactly what I needed." "One more thing," he said. "The contract itself, the one that was forwarded to you. I've identified the timing of its signature in relation to the hospital's own records. He signed it at 2:17 in the afternoon, on the day of your DNC procedure." "During," I said. "During," Robert confirmed. I did not say anything to that. I simply nodded, recorded the detail on my legal pad, and moved to the next item on the list I had been keeping since the evening of day 1. I want to tell you about a second confrontation that I have not yet described, one that occurred not with Marcus, but with Celeste Moreau herself. It was not planned. It happened 2 weeks after Marcus moved out, during a period when I was deeply absorbed in the formal legal proceedings and had given almost no direct thought to Celeste as a separate individual, focusing instead on the documentation and the financial case that was rapidly being assembled with Diane's team. I was leaving my firm's office building at approximately 7 in the evening when a woman I recognized immediately from Robert's photographs was standing outside, apparently waiting. She was younger than the photographs had suggested, softer looking in person, with an expression that carried something I had not expected to see, genuine distress. "Are you Nina?" she asked. "I am," I said, and kept walking. "I need to tell you something," she said, falling into step beside me with a determination that made me stop and look at her directly for the first time. I want to be honest about my initial feeling in that moment because I think honesty matters. I felt absolutely nothing resembling sympathy. I looked at this woman, 27 years old, 8 months into a relationship with my husband, preparing to move into my home while I was in the hospital, and felt a cold, measured absence of any softness whatsoever. "I don't need anything from you," I said. "He told me your marriage was already over," she said, quickly, as though she had rehearsed this and needed to get it out before I walked away. "He told me you'd been separated for months. He told me you both wanted different things and it had been dead for a long time. He told me the reason you were doing the fertility treatments together was because you were putting up a front for your families." I looked at her. "He told me," she continued, her voice shaking slightly now, "that you knew about me, that you'd both agreed to start living separate lives, that the contract was actually your idea, a way of formalizing the arrangement so there was no confusion about the transition." I held her gaze for a moment without speaking. "He was lying to you," I said finally, and my voice was completely flat.
"Calm."
The specific, controlled calm I use when I am delivering a statement of fact that requires no emotional embellishment. We were not separated. There was no mutual agreement. I had no knowledge of you until a forwarded email arrived in my inbox the day I came home from the hospital after my miscarriage. The contract was entirely his idea, signed during my D&C procedure, without my knowledge and against my interests. Whatever version of our marriage Marcus presented to you was fabricated for the purpose of managing your participation in his plan without requiring your informed consent to the actual circumstances. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, and I watched, with a detachment I found genuinely surprising in myself, as the specific color of a person understanding they have been deceived moved through her expression. "I didn't know about the miscarriage," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's why I'm telling you, so you can make whatever decisions you're going to make next with accurate information, rather than the version of events he constructed for you." I paused. "But I want to be clear about something. My sympathy for you is limited by the fact that 8 months is a long time to be involved with a married man, regardless of what you were told about the state of his marriage. People in genuinely separated marriages do not tell their wives they love them on the morning of major surgery. People who are transparently in transition do not drive their wives home from the hospital and put them to bed and kiss their forehead and then go sign housing contracts for their girlfriend." She did not respond to that. I do not think she had a response available. "I'm going to keep walking now," I said. "I don't need you to apologize, and I don't need your explanation. What I needed, I've been building legally and professionally for the past 2 weeks, and it's nearly complete. Whatever you decide to do with what I've just told you is entirely your own business." I walked away. She did not follow. I do not know what Celeste did with that conversation. I do not know whether she confronted Marcus, or ended the relationship, or simply absorbed the information and continued forward. I made no effort to find out. She existed, for me, at the periphery of what had actually happened. Not innocent, exactly, but not the center of it either. The center of it, and the center of everything I had been building since that Thursday evening at the kitchen table, was Marcus. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday, approximately 3 months into the proceedings, and I attended it in my professional capacity as a witness to the financial fraud components of the case rather than simply as a party to the divorce, a distinction my own firm's conflict of interest counsel had carefully reviewed and approved, given the overlap between the personal and professional aspects of everything involved. Marcus arrived with his attorney, a man named Gregory Stalls, who had a reputation in the Charlottesville legal community as competent and moderately aggressive. Gregory had clearly briefed Marcus carefully on what to expect, which meant Marcus arrived composed, dressed appropriately, and prepared with a set of careful, qualified answers designed to minimize the apparent premeditation of his actions. It didn't work. I want to describe the deposition's key exchange in some detail, because I think it captures something important about the specific, ironic symmetry of being a litigator whose own marriage becomes the subject of litigation. Diane was conducting the deposition. She began, as she always does, with an extended period of baseline questions, professional history, financial overview, the kind of opening that allows a witness to become comfortable in their own performance before the more consequential questions arrive. Then, she asked about the contract. "Mr. Reed, can you describe the purpose of the contract you signed with Ms. Celeste Moreau on March 14th? "It was a household management arrangement," Marcus said. "Smooth. Rehearsed. And can you explain why a household of 2 adults, with no children, No significant entertaining schedule, and no property requiring specialized management. Would require a live-in household coordinator?
A pause.
My wife's upcoming recovery from surgery meant we would need additional support in the home. Your wife's recovery, Diane said. The surgery being referenced is the DNC procedure performed on March 14th? Yes. The same day you signed this contract. Around that time, yes. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Diane said, sliding a time-stamped copy of the contract across the table. Our records indicate the DNC procedure was performed between 1:45 and approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Can you clarify whether you signed this contract before or after your wife's procedure was completed? The pause that followed was long enough to be audible. I'm not certain of the exact timing, Marcus said carefully. You're not certain, Diane repeated. Let me ask you something else then. Ms. Moreau's contract describes her responsibilities as including companionship and personal support for household principals. Can you explain what companionship entails in the context of a household management arrangement? Gregory Stalls objected. Diane proceeded. Can you describe your personal relationship with Ms. Moreau prior to the signing of this contract? We were acquainted professionally, Marcus said. Acquainted professionally, Diane said. Were you acquainted professionally when you traveled to Aspen, Colorado, in January of this year, at an expense billed to your company's client relations account? Another pause. We may have overlapped at a professional event. And in Nassau in October? And in New York in September? Diane slid 3 additional documents across the table. These are hotel records from each of those trips, Mr. Reed. Can you explain why a professional acquaintance appears on the same room reservation in all 3 instances? Gregory called for a break. Marcus asked for water. When they reconvened 20 minutes later, Marcus's carefully rehearsed composure had developed visible cracks. Not in any dramatic, cinematic way, he was still controlled, still managing himself. But the specific quality of that control had changed, tightened, become the visible management of something rather than the natural ease of someone who has nothing to conceal. I watched all of this from my seat at the conference table, saying nothing, taking occasional notes on a legal pad with the unhurried attention of someone who is exactly as prepared as she has been promising to be. One more question for now, Diane said, near the end of that first session. You mentioned that the contract was intended to support your wife during her recovery from surgery. Did your wife know about the contract at the time it was signed? We had discussed the general concept of additional household support, Marcus said carefully. That's not what I asked, Diane said. Did your wife know about this specific contract with this specific individual on the day it was signed? The silence lasted almost 6 seconds. She was made aware of the arrangement, Marcus said. When? Diane asked. Another silence. At some point during her recovery. At some point, Diane said. Mr. Reed, your wife became aware of this contract on the evening of March 16th, when your assistant inadvertently forwarded the document to your wife's email address instead of your own. Would you like to revise your answer about when she was made aware? Gregory Stalls called for another break. I used the break to drink my coffee, review my notes, and send Diane a text message containing exactly one word. Beautiful. She replied with a single emoji. We have a professional understanding about courtroom communication. 2 years later. I want to close this story in a different place than the confrontations and the depositions, because I think the aftermath, the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding a life after a betrayal this specific, deserves more than a summary. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I am still in the house. I did not expect to want to stay initially, but I found that the house itself was not the problem. The associations were, and those associations, I discovered, are more subject to deliberate reconstruction than I had anticipated. I have repainted, reorganized, had the kitchen table replaced. I have hosted dinner parties in rooms where I once delivered confrontations. I have made, room by room, the house that had been ours into something that is straightforwardly and completely mine. I tried one more pregnancy. With a different path, different circumstances, the deliberate planning of a person who has learned to stop assuming that the architecture around any important thing will simply hold without examination. I will not describe the outcome of that attempt here, because some things remain private even in the context of a story told as completely as I have told this one. I will say only that I continue to try, and that I approach that continuing with the same methodical, attentive determination I bring to everything else in the life I have built since that Thursday in March.
Marcus, and I do not speak.
The divorce was clean, in the legal sense, because I had been thorough enough in my preparation that there was very little left to dispute once the proceedings actually began. He received what the settlement entitled him to receive. I retained the house, a majority of the assets whose provenance traced to my own income and premarital savings, and a settlement figure that reflected the documented financial fraud in a way that Gregory Stalls had ultimately advised his client not to contest. I do not know where Marcus is now. I know what city, because our professional communities have occasional overlaps that make complete informational isolation impossible. I do not know how he is, and I find that I genuinely do not think about it with any frequency. He is not, in any meaningful sense, part of my life. Diane and I had dinner last month at a restaurant we have been going to together for 12 years. We do not often discuss what happened because there is no longer much to discuss. The case is closed, the outcomes are documented. The grief has been processed through proper channels rather than accumulated indefinitely. Do you think about it much? She asked at some point during the meal. Less than I expected to, I said honestly. The specific events, the sequence of things, not very often anymore. What I think about is what it taught me. Which was? I thought about this before answering, the same careful consideration I try to bring to any question that deserves an honest rather than a reflexive answer. That the people who betray you most thoroughly are usually the ones who believe, most confidently, that they know your limitations, I said. Marcus thought he knew exactly what I was and wasn't capable of when I was grieving. He was right that I was grieving. He was wrong about everything else. Diane raised her glass. To being wrong about everything else, she said. I raised mine. To being exactly who you actually are, I said, at precisely the moment someone assumed you weren't. We drank to that. Outside, the evening was doing something beautiful with the light, the specific gold of a late summer evening in Virginia that I have always found, regardless of what else is happening, genuinely consoling. I finished my wine. I drove home to the house that is mine. I sat for a while in the kitchen, the new table, the repainted walls, and I felt, for a moment, the simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of having done exactly what I said I would do, from exactly the position everyone assumed would make it impossible. That satisfaction has not left me.
I do not think it will.
I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my mother because I think it belongs in this story in a way I haven't made room for yet, and because her reaction captured something that no amount of legal documentation or strategic preparation could quite express. I called my mother the evening after I confronted Marcus, after he had left with his bag and the house had gone quiet in a way it would not stop being for several months. My mother lives in Charlotte, 3.5 hours away, and she had known about the miscarriage because I had called her from the hospital, which was the natural thing to do. She did not know, until I called that second evening, about any of the rest of it. She listened without interrupting while I told her everything, which is unusual for her. My mother is, by nature, a person who responds in real time, who interjects, who processes audibly. The fact that she stayed completely silent for the full 15 minutes it took me to describe everything from the forwarded email to Marcus's departure told me more about the specific quality of her shock than any words could have. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. He signed the contract during the procedure, she said finally. Yes. Another silence. Mina, she said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Go ahead. How are you, not as an attorney, not as a woman who has a plan and is executing it? How are you? I sat with the question for a long time before I answered. I don't know yet, I said. I think there's a version of how I'm doing that I won't have access to until I stop being quite as focused as I am right now. I think there's probably something underneath all of this that I am going to have to feel at some point when there isn't an immediate legal strategy requiring my full attention. That's an attorney answer, my mother said. I know, I said. It's the answer I have available right now. She drove to Charlottesville the next morning without asking, arriving at 10 o'clock with a bag she had packed the night before, apparently having decided during our call that she was coming regardless of what I said about it. She stayed for 5 days. She cooked, she sat with me, She did not push me to process anything faster than I was processing it, and she asked once with carefully chosen gentleness whether I wanted to talk about the miscarriage itself rather than the broader situation.
Not yet, I said.
Okay, she said, and did not ask again until I brought it up myself, several weeks later, over the phone, in a conversation that had nothing to do with legal proceedings and everything to do with the specific, lonely texture of grief for something so briefly present that almost no one outside the two people directly involved ever had the chance to fully understand its significance. I am grateful for that phone call, and for the 5 days she spent in my house, in a way I find difficult to fully articulate. Not because it changed anything practical. By the time she arrived, the legal machinery was already in motion and did not require her involvement. But because grief requires witnesses, and I had spent so much of that first week being a strategist that I had not yet had the opportunity to simply be the person who was also, underneath all of it, in genuine and significant pain. My mother was that witness for 5 days in my kitchen, and it mattered more than anything the legal process could eventually provide. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Diane and I had a conversation that I want to include here because I think it illuminates something important about what it actually means to be a professional litigator confronting a crisis in your own personal life. That we were having lunch on a Tuesday, the ordinary professional lunch that we have been having together at least twice a month for 12 years. And she said something that surprised me. I want to tell you something about how you handled those first 72 hours, she said.
Go ahead, I said.
I have represented a lot of people through situations similar to what you went through, she said carefully. Not identical. I've never had a client who found a forwarded contract while still wearing a hospital bracelet from a miscarriage. But the essential shape of the betrayal, the sudden discovery of a sustained deception, is something I've sat across the table from many times. And I want you to know that the way you handled it was genuinely unusual, she said. Not just competent. Unusual. Most people, even extremely intelligent, professionally capable people, spend the first several days in a state that significantly impairs their ability to think strategically. The combination of grief and shock and the immediate, visceral pain of betrayal, it usually slows people down. Sometimes for weeks. You're telling me I'm cold, I said. I'm telling you the opposite, she said. You were not cold. I know you well enough to know you were not cold. You were in significant pain throughout those 72 hours. You just refused to let that pain compromise your strategy, which is an extraordinary thing to be able to do in the specific circumstances you were in. I thought about that for a moment. I think, I said slowly, what actually happened is that the attorney part of me and the grieving person part of me genuinely separated during that period. Not because I forced them apart. I don't think I could have forced anything at that point. But because the forwarded email gave me something actionable to focus on, and the actionable focus created a kind of container that allowed the grief to exist without overtaking the function. The function being the work, Diane said. The function being the work, I agreed. I think if there had been no clear path forward, no contract, no evidence to gather, no strategy to build, I might have simply fallen apart. The legal framework gave me somewhere to put myself that wasn't just suffering. I've seen that pattern before, Diane said. People who are also professional in relevant fields often describe their professional mode as a kind of scaffolding during personal crises. It keeps the structure standing while the interior rebuilds. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I think she was right, and I think the corollary is also true. The scaffolding eventually comes down, and what it reveals is the actual state of the interior, which is not always as solid as the scaffolding made it appear from the outside. The interior, in my case, took considerably longer to fully process than the legal case did. The depositions concluded before the grief fully resolved. The divorce was finalized before I fully understood the specific shape of what I was mourning, not just the marriage, but the version of myself who had believed, without examination, that she was exceptionally good at reading people and who was forced, by everything that happened, to develop a more complicated, more honest relationship with her own capacity for willful blindness in the service of hope. I am still working on that relationship.
I suspect I will be for some time.
That is not a wound I'm trying to close prematurely. It is, I think, one of the more valuable things to have come out of the entire ordeal. A clearer, more honest understanding of exactly where my professional acuity ends and my personal vulnerability begins, and exactly what I need to do, going forward, to ensure those two things exist in conversation with each other rather than in the mutual ignorance they apparently maintained throughout my marriage to Marcus. I want to close the story with something more direct than the narrative that's carried us here, a statement as plainly as I can make it, of what I actually learned. I know now that grief is not incompatible with function, that devastation and strategy can exist simultaneously in the same person, that the moment someone assumes you are too broken to be paying attention is precisely the moment you need to be paying the most attention of your life. I know that love, genuine and sustained, can coexist with willful blindness, and that the willful blindness does not make the love false. It just means you are choosing, repeatedly, and at some level consciously, not to examine something that part of you already suspected. I made that choice for 18 months. I do not entirely blame myself for it. I also do not pretend it was not a choice. I know that the people who betray you most effectively are the ones who understand your specific patterns of reassurance seeking. The things you tell yourself, the explanations you reach for, the charitable readings you offer when evidence of something darker is present, but not yet undeniable. Marcus understood these patterns in me and used them skillfully for as long as they held. They stopped holding the moment I found that contract. I know that a forwarded email, mistyped in haste by a young woman who will never know the full scope of what she inadvertently set in motion, can be the thing that changes the entire trajectory of a person's life. That small, accidental moments of transparency sometimes do more than any deliberate confrontation could have accomplished. And I know, finally, that rebuilding is slower and less linear than any strategic plan accounts for, and that the part of you that needs to rebuild is not the same part that executed the strategy, and both of them deserve the same patient, methodical attention you'd bring to any other complex, time-sensitive project that matters deeply. I am still rebuilding. I am still paying attention. I am still 3 years out from a Thursday when I sat at a kitchen table in my coat with a hospital bracelet on my wrist and a forwarded contract on my screen. The same person I was in that moment, except more honest about exactly what I am capable of and exactly what I had been choosing for 18 months not to see. I think that honesty is worth the cost of having acquired it. I do not say that lightly. It was a significant cost. But I think, finally, I believe it anyway.